get the engine started and we can get going. So welcome to another car stream. The angle feels a bit weird, but that's what it is. So I will have to remember to talk a little bit louder to ensure that you can hear me over the sound of the engine. Let me just try to get out of this parking space so we can get to chatting. So I'm just heading home from a walk in the park today. That's a weird expression, isn't it? It's like it was a walk in a park. But I literally mean a walk in a park. Like it's not a euphemism for something. Anyway, all right. So we're heading home, and I thought this would be a good opportunity for a car chat or car stream or whatever I'm calling them. And I was thinking about what I could talk about. There are actually quite a few videos that I want to respond to that have come up recently on like Cameron's channel and Trinity Radio and some others, but I feel like those are better left for not car streams, right? Because I need to actually watch them and respond to them. So, but it's been interesting to see what people have been coming out with lately. I feel like the quality of the content has been kind of low lately on the YouTube apologetic and religious discussion kind of that's what I'm looking for area. I guess Cameron had his, or did he have it, or is about to have his like CCV2 conference or whatever he's calling them. I feel like he already had it, but then I saw an advertisement for tickets, so I'm slightly confused about that, but whatever. I saw an advertisement also on his channel for yet another t-shirt design. I think, was this one about the Kalam cosmological argument? I'm introverted, but I might talk about the Kalam or something like that. This is the sort of thing that I mean by like low quality content. Like what is the point of things like that? Like most people don't know what the Kalam cosmological argument is. I suppose you could say, well, the t-shirts is to start conversations, but I feel like that if you have a t-shirt that only has words on it and it mentions a strange word followed by argument, most people are not going to want to get into whatever that is. They might not know what it is, but they're like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that. Like, that's a weird thing. It sounds kind of annoying. I just don't think that's a good way to start a conversation, personally, even though I'm into like funny t-shirt sort of things, and I just got in the wrong lane. But so it raises the question what the point of it is. And it seems to me that it's more of a fashion accessory than anything else, which, I guess that's all right if that's your thing, but it just seems a bit cringe, to be honest. I feel like a lot of the apologetic stuff is more cultural affectation than genuine interest in philosophy. I mean, I guess that comes across as a bit strong, but when it comes to t-shirts like that, or like massive bookshelves of books that you can't possibly have read, at least most people, right? Or all of this sort of meme presentation of your views, can't help but think it's not really about, or it's not primarily about trying to find out what's true. But anyway, some things that have been on my mind recently. So one is like design, I suppose. And there have been a few things that have come up. There was that stream on Rebecca's channel. I forget the name of the person she had on talking about the origin of life. I know there's been a few responses to that. I haven't actually watched the original video, but I did see some of the responses to it. And so I thought I might, and also there was another video that Cameron put up recently about something about our atheists ignoring fine-tuning, or he didn't say ignoring, it was some other word. But anyway, it was about fine-tuning. I strongly doubt there's anything very novel in, why can't I see chat? Oh, there it is. What was I going to say? I strongly doubt there's anything really novel in that video, but I could be wrong, so I need to check it out. But I think it would be, yeah. So these sort of things mean that I'm thinking a bit more about design type arguments and how they fit into things. So let me share some thoughts about that. So one question is what design arguments are supposed to do, right? I mean, they're supposed to be inferences from certain data to the fact that these data are the result of design processes, like God designing ultimately, right? Whether that's a watchmaker argument or a fine-tuning argument or an origin of life argument or similar sorts of things. They're all sort of similar. The data they're appealing to differ, and the form of the argument can vary a little bit, but it's fundamentally the same thing. There's certain data that we observe, and we're going to infer that the best explanation or the best way to account for the data is design. I don't think any of these are supposed to be deductive arguments. At least that's not the way that I see them discussed typically, and I don't think they really work as deductive. I think they work as some sort of inference to the best explanation. I think that's true of most arguments, but some arguments can be phrased in more deductive terms. But I think especially design arguments are really canonical cases of inferences to explanation, right? Or abductive arguments. Now, second thoughts. I don't think I want to be in that lane. So why does that matter? Well, it matters a lot because we have to understand what the argument is supposed to be accomplishing. If it's an inference to the best explanation, I've made this point many times before, you always need to establish that you have a better explanation than whatever other explanation you're trying to eliminate. If that's naturalism or a competing religious tradition or whatever else, you need to establish that there is in fact a best explanation or a better explanation. Simply discrediting an explanation, discrediting a rival explanation, in no way establishes that you have a better one. That is such an obvious point that you'd think that, well, why are you even saying that, right? But people make this mistake repeatedly, not just in religious apologetics, in politics and elsewhere, right? But it's especially rife in I think, religious apologetics and counter-apologetics as well, for that matter. Simply discrediting an explanation or highlighting problems with it does absolutely nothing. And let me be clear here, absolutely nothing by itself to establish any other explanation. You have to establish at the minimum that one explanation has less problems than another or is more plausible than another for any type of inference to the best explanation to get off the ground. You don't have to establish that your explanation is great, but at least that it has fewer problems or is better in some respects than a rival. At bare minimum, for it to be even a start of an argument, right? Otherwise, you've just identified some flaws in another argument, in another explanation. By itself, establishes nothing about your position. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no validity in highlighting flaws or problems or limitations of other explanations. That's perfectly a good thing to do, right? But it doesn't do anything to establish an alternate position, and that's where people go wrong, right? So, naturalists can't explain X. May or may not be true, right? And that could be an interesting discussion. But there is no therefore God or therefore supernaturalism or therefore something beyond the natural. That just doesn't come into it at all. It's completely fallacious to make any inferences whatsoever about a rival explanation or rival theory on the basis merely of highlighting problems in one theory, right? You need to, so the point I'm making here is that any type of attempt to make an abductive or inferential inference-based explanation type argument must be at least partly comparative. That is, you must do at least some comparative work to establish why your preferred explanation is better than a rival explanation in at least some respects. You don't have to obviously consider every respect necessarily, but you have to at least do some comparative work. That's an absolute must. Otherwise, you haven't even started making an argument. So I try to emphasize that very strongly because this is so often not done. I think the resurrection is actually one of the best examples of this because many theists just make no effort to establish what their explanation is supposed to be. It's like the straw man is, well, the explanation is God done it, right? The problem is, the thing is, that's not really a straw man. Like, that's literally the explanation that's offered. I literally debated, well, this isn't about the resurrection, but I debated a Muslim apologist, wasn't even that long ago, like 2 years ago, I think now, about the meaning of life. It's linked on the channel if you're interested, right? And he didn't really offer any theory about the meaning of life or where it comes from or how to make sense of that. He just criticized naturalists and atheists for not being able to account for it, right? And like later on in the debate, I explicitly raised this. I'm like, I have literally no idea about what your view is on the meaning of life or where it comes from or how to make sense of that or what the theory is. And before I came to this debate, I said I could have surmised that, well, you think it relates to God in some way, and at the end of the debate, that's where I still am. I was like, well, presumably you think that God gives life meaning or something, right? But like, that's literally where I'm still at. I have no more meat to put on the bones, nothing else to say in virtue of explanation. That was my criticism of him, right? And other people came up to me at the end of the debate and said that they basically agreed. Like, they didn't necessarily agree with everything I said, but they agreed that my interlocutor hadn't really said anything very substantive about what he thought about the meaning of life. And, that's just one example, right? But this happens all the time in these debates, where the theist will criticize naturalism or atheism for failing to explain this or that, or not having the resources to explain, without really giving any account, without even trying to give an account as to what theism or what their brand of theism adds to the quality of the explanation, what explanatory resources it brings to the table. And I raise this in almost every debate or discussion I have about these issues, because I feel like that it is the single biggest problem in apologetics. And few apologists seem genuinely, I don't want to be too strong, but so many people who make these arguments just don't seem to care. They don't seem to be very interested in explaining how God resurrected Jesus is a good explanation for, like, the minimal facts, for example, or how God did it is a good explanation for fine tuning, etc., for other arguments. So coming back to design, right? You can probably see where I'm going with this, but what I've been trying to emphasize is the absolute necessity of making a comparative case or comparative argument if you're even going to start making a design type argument. Therefore, if one doesn't even attempt to do that, I would just say you haven't even made an argument. All you've done, you haven't made an argument for like God or for against naturalism or anything. All you've done, at best, even if we just take everything that they've said at face value, at best, you've just identified problems with one approach, naturalism or whatever, at accounting for certain data. And that is not an argument for anything. It's just highlighting the problems. And at that point, the naturalist can literally just say, I agree with everything that you have said. And then say, but naturalism, but like your explanation is still, or like I have no reason to accept your explanation. I have no reason to accept God. And that's really it, because they haven't given you anything else. So I think that that's the fundamental question. So let's take the issue of the origin of life as an example. Most apologists that I see don't use this argument, I think because they recognize it's a very weak argument, because it's so sensitive to the current scientific knowledge, more so than like cosmological fine-tuning. Plausibly, I think. And Rebecca's recommended a book to me about this, which I need to read and give a review of. I did a podcast episode on the origin of life, where I talked about some of the science, but that was it was like 10 years ago now. And I imagine that there's probably a lot more recent evidence that needs to be considered. So I'm a bit out of date with some of that, but I do have some knowledge of some of the literature, at least. It's certainly true that naturalism scientists don't have a full explanation for how life originated, just like we don't for consciousness either. There's many things that we don't have full explanations for. Perhaps never will, although that's a much stronger claim to make. But anyway, nothing whatever follows from that about belief in God or arguments for God or the existence of God. So what might an argument look like? Like, what could the theist say? And this is, I think, the critical thing. What could the theist say to turn this into an argument for the existence of God, for believing in the existence of God, or for increasing our credence in the existence of God or something? Well, I think what they would have to offer is an explanation for the origin of life, which includes God in it, essentially. It has to include God in it, because otherwise the naturalist could just agree with it, right? Or, even if it doesn't include God, it may, like, maybe you could appeal to some sort of supernatural force that is not a single omnipotent agent. So that would be non-natural, but not God. So just appealing to that wouldn't be sufficient either. You would have to specifically appeal to, say, an omni-God if we're to get theism out of it. So what we need is an explanation for the origin of life, which includes God in it as a key component of the explanation, but is better than any rival naturalistic explanation that's currently on the table. So that's what needs to be done, I think, for it to really count as an argument. Otherwise, it's just you've identified problems with the current naturalistic understanding of or understandings of the origin of life. Okay, but what does that explanation look like? What is the theistic explanation or atheistic explanation of the origin of life that accounts for the data better than existing naturalistic ones? And I think this is where the rubber hits the road, because I just don't think there is one. At least I haven't heard one. Now, maybe we can try to steal man here and come up with something. So let's just start at the very basics. Well, God created life, right? I mean, he could, right? He has the power to do that. It was like maybe God created the first single cellular organism that then was able to replicate. Let's be a bit more specific, okay? At some point, billions of years ago, God created the first functioning single cellular organism, which was then the ancestor of the rest of life on Earth. Let's go with that. So that's our explanation, right? Well, to assess an explanation, we need to assess its explanatory scope, its explanatory power, and its plausibility, at the very least. Its consistency with other things that we believe. So obviously this explanation that we have here postulates the existence of God. That's fine. We can regard that as an explanatory postulate. So scientific explanations, I seem to have hit traffic, by the way, so that's annoying, but gives us more time to stream, I suppose, so it depends on your perspective. But anyway, explanatory postulates are perfectly fine. We make those in science all the time. So we can regard here as an explanatory postulate, which will be justified to the extent that it allows us to account for the data. The data is like, well, life seems to have originated from non-life, or in a way that we don't understand, however you want to phrase that data. I don't want to necessarily get into all the specifics here, but you can add in specific data about the fossil record or biochemistry and whatever it is you want to include there, right? So that's our data. The question is how to account for that. So but the thing is that merely stipulating that there's an omni-being doesn't actually entail with any probability the observed facts, right? Because you could have an omni-God who didn't create life, or who at least didn't create physical life, or who didn't create life that has any biochemical makeup, right? So you can see the problem already, that we're going to need more structure than just God exists. There's going to need to be some reason for God to create life, some desire or purpose, or however you want to phrase that, right? So we need to stipulate not just that God exists, but also that he actually created life. Maybe you could stipulate that he had a reason to create life, and it follows from that he then did. Or you could just flat out stipulate that he did, regardless of whether he had reasons to do it. Those would be two different avenues, right? Let's just say we just stipulate that there is a God and God created life, as a single cellular organism. It's important to note that we need both of those things. You can't just stipulate that God created life, because we haven't established, God's not in our background evidence, right? Because this is supposed to be an argument for the existence of God. So you need to stipulate that separately as an explanatory postulate. Nor can you just stipulate God's existence, because as I've said, nothing whatever follows from God's existence about the existence of life. You need also to stipulate that he created life, or had a reason to create life, and so forth. So that's two postulates, right? I think that given those two postulates, you do explain the facts, right? At least minimally, you explain the existence of life. We can't really say anything about the specifics that life takes. You need then to postulate more specifics about, well, why did God create life in the way that he did, like with the particular biochemistry, or in the time, like the given time after the Earth was formed and things like that. You can't really say anything more specific than that. All you can say is that, well, we would expect to see, single cellular life emerge from non-life, given that God existed and that he created it, right? I think that does follow. Okay, so we've explained, so we have the explanatory power. There's been an accident. I think that was why we had the traffic jam there. So God exists and he had a desire to create, or just did create life. Has the explanatory power to account for the data, but it doesn't have very good explanatory scope, because it can only account for that minimal data. We can't make any further predictions or explain any other data other than the mere existence of like single cellular life that previously, like from non-living substrate. We can't say anything else about the form of that life, or the mechanisms that gave rise to it, because there aren't mechanisms, right? There's no mechanism to give, right? God just did it, right? So it has very weak explanatory scope. What about plausibility? Well, that depends on how plausible you think that it was for God to exist, and how plausible it is for God to create life, or have the desire to create life. Now I'm getting spammed. If there are any mods that happen to be in chat at the moment, I don't think I have very many, but it would be nice if someone could deal with that. But I guess that's the disadvantage of having a car chat, is that I can't really moderate. Anyway, I apologize for that. But anyways, so the point is that minimal God did it explanation has the explanatory power if you make the two postulates, but it's unclear what the plausibility is. Well, like if I could make you a mod, well then I could just moderate it myself, right? So that's sort of the problem. But anyway, I'll look at that when I get home. I need to make more mods. But anyway, the point is that we have explanatory power, we don't have very much explanatory scope, and plausibility, well, that depends on who you ask, so I won't comment on that. At least that's contested, right? It's not obviously very plausible that God existed and created life. That depends on your background beliefs. It's not something we share. It's not generally accepted, right? All right, so that's where we are with a very simple explanation. Theistic explanation. I'm not saying that's the only one, but that's a very straightforward one, simplistic minimalist one. We could add more to that, of course. We could add more structure to what God wants to create or design, and that's going to increase the explanatory scope. Maybe there's a reason for God to create at the time he did, or in the way that he did, in the form that he did, with the biochemistry that he did, etc. But that's going to come at the expense of more postulates, which is going to reduce the plausibility. So, maybe there's a story that we could tell there, but probably we're going to need to bring in more considerations to justify certain postulates. So maybe we can add more postulates, but to justify those, we're going to add in additional considerations like moral considerations or cosmological considerations. Like we're going to have further facts to justify the postulates that we make to account for aspects of the origin of life, right? Hopefully you see that, right? But at least at a minimal, like at a simplistic explanation of what God did it, we don't have much explanatory scope. Now, let's contrast that to a minimal naturalistic explanation. So we looked at a minimal theistic explanation. Let's contrast that to a minimal naturalistic explanation. What's a minimal naturalistic explanation going to look like? Well, it's basically going to say that some combination of biochemical processes that's not currently understood, but is at least consistent with what is currently understood, gave rise to the first single-cellular organism. I mean, and that's generally what's accepted scientifically, right? Certain pieces of the puzzle are understood. I won't really get into that here. That's for another stream. Certain pieces of the puzzle are understood. Many pieces are not understood. We don't understand how the pieces fit together very well. So a certain way that these combine together that's not currently known gave rise to the first single-cellular organism. That's a minimal naturalistic explanation. So that involves a postulate about how pieces of biochemistry, or maybe like pre-biochemistry, fit together. How plausible you regard that is, again, is going to depend on your background beliefs, right? The thing is, though, that the explanatory power is certainly there, right? I've kind of stipulated it in the way that it accounts for the fact that the first single-cellular organism came about. What about the explanatory scope? Well, I think that's where the big difference lies, right? Because the explanatory scope of whatever this explanation is going to necessarily be allow us to situate the explanation in the context of current biochemistry. So like when I say that a combination of biochemical processes came together to give rise to the first single-cellular organism, necessarily that's going to be in the context of carbon-based chemistry and lipids and nucleic acids and amino acids and so forth. Because that explanation necessarily builds upon and extends on and exists in the context of current biochemistry. Whereas notice that the theistic explanation does not, because God is not beholden to any particular biochemistry, unless you stipulate that he is for some reason, right? I think that's the core of the difference here. A naturalistic explanation necessarily has explanatory scope about what it can say, what it will say, what specific statements it will make about the details of mechanisms and existing biochemical knowledge, whereas the theistic explanation can't and won't unless you just invoke that as more postulates. You don't need to invoke those as additional postulates for a naturalistic explanation, essentially because that's part of our widely accepted background knowledge. Like the theist accepts all the same biochemistry, right? So that they're not going to need to invoke that as a separate postulate, whereas the naturalist does not accept the same postulates about God. So any additional explanatory mechanism that the theist wants to appeal to must be invoked as additional postulates. That's where the asymmetry lies, precisely because the theist is attempting to get more out of the explanation, they're attempting to get God out of it. They need to put more into it in order to construct an explanation that requires God. That's the fundamental difference. I'm not saying that that's not possible. I'm not saying that that can't be done. What I'm saying is that the theist will need to justify all of the postulates about God that they make and show that those postulates are necessary and sufficient to give an explanation which has greater explanatory scope and power relative to the data that they're trying to explain, compared to the rival naturalistic explanations. And that's where I think that there is a fundamental difficulty that I've not really seen theists even really attempt to account for. Again, I'm not saying that I've seen all attempts here, so I could be missing important approaches here. Probably are some, right? But the challenge is, how is it that the theist can account for enough data, like have enough explanatory scope, without invoking a million different postulates about, well, God wanted to do the chemistry in this way and he wanted it to do it in that way, because God is omnipotent, right? This is the problem. How do you constrain God's action so as to account for the facts without stipulating a whole bunch of ad hoc assumptions about God's desires or behavior? I don't really see the way around that. Maybe there is, but I'm not seeing it. Now, the difference with the naturalist is that they don't have to invoke they have to invoke some additional postulates about unknown ways that chemistry works that we haven't discovered yet. But they don't need to invoke as many because we already share with theists a vast array of knowledge about biochemistry. So the question is, what is it that the theist can account for that the naturalist can't, that does not require just as many new assumptions? I think that's a fundamental question. Yeah, chat's getting a bit out of hand. I apologize. I don't know if I can I just all right, let's see if this works. Wait, did I just make the spammer the moderator? I'm not sure if I did the exact opposite of what I wanted to do. Oh, I don't want to fiddle around with this while I'm driving too much. I thought it might just be easy. Oh well, I can fix it later. I can delete the comments. Please just ignore the chat if you're watching. Anyway, what was I saying? Yes, okay, so that was a bit about the origin of life, right? I think that's the fundamental issue. And note that I think that there's one sort of addendum I wanted to make to that. None of what I said requires any significant knowledge of or appeal to specific claims about abiogenesis, right? Everything that I said are very generic philosophical considerations and methodological considerations. That's important because too often these debates, and not just origin of life, but others as well, get bogged down in details that are not relevant, or at least at first pass are not relevant to the discussion. Obviously, if we're going to compare explanations for abiogenesis, we need to get into the details. But it's very easy to miss the forest from the trees and miss the point that what we need to do is compare rival explanations on their explanatory merits. If we're not doing that, if we're just talking about specifics, if all we do is debate how good this or that naturalistic explanation is, we have not even started to have the discussion about whether this is a good argument for the existence of God. And that's what I want to emphasize. It's not just that it's not sufficient. We haven't even started to have that discussion if all we do is analyze rival naturalistic explanations, because this is true not just for the origin of life, but that's a relevant contrast here. It's true for fine-tuning as well. We must necessarily have the discussion about what is it that the theist explanation is adding to the table, and how does that improve our explanatory situation? How does the postulates that we make improve our explanatory situation relative to the extra postulates that must be made? If we don't have that discussion, we're not even really doing philosophy of religion. We're just talking about science or like different or historical accounts or whatever it is, right? Probably things that we don't know very much about and shouldn't talk about. If we're trying to actually have that discussion, then we should spend a lot more time trying to frame it in terms of what is it that we're trying to account for, and how do our preferred explanations do that better than rivals? So that's the fundamental point that I wanted to make. And I think a lot of the discussion just doesn't even talk about that, and so is essentially irrelevant. All right, so that is sort of what I want to say about design. Let's have that discussion. I'm super interested in having that discussion. I don't know that how many theists are actually interested in having that discussion. Because if theists are just fine with God did it and that's good enough for me, which honestly some theists are, like William Lane Craig has almost explicitly said that about certain things, then I don't really know that there's much discussion to be had. But hopefully there is more discussion to be had, and I think there is. All right, so I also mentioned that I think I put in the title something about morality. and I'm actually making good time. So before I get home, I wanted to say something about that. Oh, actually, I'm coming up to a red light, so maybe I can quickly see if I can do something about chat. Yeah, so morality. So morality is the other big one that's like a perennial discussion, right? And I reckon that it's oh geez. Oh no, I did make someone a moderator who wasn't. I'm just going to make random people moderators and hope someone will get rid of all this spam. All right, just added a few moderators, so please fix things. Fix things for me. All right, morality. All right, so again, I think what I want to say is sort of meta points about talking about morality and like meta ethics. So when I talk about morality, particularly I'm talking about sort of meta ethics. Although these days we're seeing more discussion about topical political issues related to morality without saying a word that might get me demonetized. But yeah, so I think that these discussions do matter because we need to have those discussions, right? We need to decide what the locus of value is, and we need to be able to have serious discussions about that. And I want to do some videos on this in the near future, but you know, there's lots of things that I want to do. Anyway, so how do we have a good discussion about meta ethics? Well, I think the failure in a lot of discussions is that neither naturalists, or like atheists, nor theists really know how to talk about meta ethics. I guess that's a bit of a bold claim to make, but what I mean by this is I think that they don't have a good perception of what the issues are. I think that's a good way to put it. They don't have a good perception of like philosophically what the issues are. And they think the issue is like, is morality objective or subjective? Or what is the argument for objective morality? Or something. Now, those are issues, but I don't think, well, there's a few ways to phrase this. I don't think that's a good way to frame the debate, first of all. It's not how the debate is usually characterized philosophically, second of all. And I think that a good way to explain it is that those questions are simply too general and too poorly specified to have the discussion in those terms. You may frame it initially in those terms, but you very quickly have to transcend that and start talking about more specific questions. So like, well, what do we mean by objective and subjective? But also beyond that. So here are some issues that are discussed in the literature and that I think that we need to get better at talking about, just generally, but also as like atheist-theist discussions. So one issue is, what is the status of rationality or reason with respect to morality? So what is the relationship between reason and morality? Do we think that morality is in some sense like a subset of rationality? That is, to be moral is to have certain moral reasons and then to act in accordance with them. So that would be, if you think of that in a strong way, being moral is just a subset of being rational or being reasonable. That is a very big question. And it relates to an issue called moral rationalism, whether you think that to have a moral obligation or to have so to have a moral obligation is to have a reason to do something. And then we have to start talking about reasons and rationality and what all of that means, right? And these are big issues. So that's one subset of things. Often this relates to issues of normativity. Because often people cash out normativity in terms of having reasons to do something, although you don't have to. You could think of it differently, right? So that's one issue, is about the relationship between morality and rationality or reasons. Another issue is value. So what does it mean for something to have value, like intrinsic value? So extrinsic value would be valuable for something else. Intrinsic value would be valuable for its own sake. So what does it mean for something to have intrinsic value? Should we think of that as like a property? Often it is, like to be morally valuable is to have some sort of property, but what sort of property might that be? Is it a natural property, or is it something that's not encapsulated in the natural order? If it's a non-natural property, how do we think of it? Like, where does it come from? And how do we know? How do we identify having intrinsic value as a property? Like, what process do we use to reason about that? This is very important because this raises much more general questions about what is it for anything to have a property? How do you identify anything as having a property? This is why, and I still don't know whether this is actually a good approach because I don't find that it's actually helpful, but this is why when people ask me sometimes, well, like, how do you know something is morally valuable? I ask them, how do you know that something is a tree? because you can think of a tree as a property, like treeness. I don't think treeness exists, right? But I think that there is a property where something is a tree or not a tree, or you can think of it as a property at least, or is green might be another example. What if you think that any property exists, right? Just ask yourself, what does it mean for that property to exist, and how do you know that something possesses that property? Because if you think that that having moral value or having intrinsic value or being valuable is a property of some sort, then we can ask similar metaphysical questions. Obviously, having intrinsic value will be a certain type of property, but we can still ask very similar questions. Well, how do you know that anything has a property? What even is a property, right? So the questions are broader. The question becomes broader than simply debating about intrinsic value. It becomes a question as to what is a property? How do we know when a property is instantiated or is possessed by a particular object or set or whatever? And what arguments can we give for and against that? That's a much broader question. Likewise, coming back to the issue about rationality or reason and morality, what is a reason? What are we doing when we give reasons to people, when we think that we're making arguments for and against something? We're presumably sharing something like a reason. What are we doing there? What do reasons do for people? Like, why do we engage in rationality or reasons talk? Only if we do that, does it seem to me, can we then answer the question as to when do I have reasons to do something? And then when do I have moral reason for doing something, if at all? So I've talked about value and questions about properties, and I've talked about reason, rationality, and how that relates to morality. I think a third issue would be questions about self-interest and morality. So what do I have? So what is the relationship between self-interest and morality, first of all? Do we think that moral actions must serve my self-interest in order for me to have a justification for doing them? That would be a position called ethical egoism. It seems that people like William Lane Craig apparently are ethical egoists, although I don't think they embrace that view, but that seems to follow from the statements that they make about it, and I'm not the only one to say this. Now, if you're an ethical egoist, you're going to have very different views about the grounding of morality and how that's all going to work than if you're not an ethical egoist, and most philosophers aren't, right? If you're not an ethical egoist, then we have to ask questions about, well, how is it that we understand the relationship between self-interest and actions that are not self-interested? What reasons can be given for non-self-interested actions? What reasons can be given for self-interested actions? Because self-interested actions are not simple either. What does it mean for something to be in your self-interest? You have to ask questions about personal identity there and like preferences. What if your preferences aren't rationally satisfiable, like that they don't, that they're intransitive, for example? Like there's issues there. There's issues about future preferences, your future self versus the present. There's issues about what if I have higher order preferences about my preferences or about my desires. Or what if I don't even know what my preferences are? Or if is that the same thing as hedonistic satisfaction? How does that relate? So there's a lot of questions there, even about the nature of self-interest. And then we have to have some sort of way of relating that to actions that might not be self-interested, if we think there are such actions, right? And how we relate that to rationality or reasons or the status of morality, right? So there's a lot of different questions there to be addressed. And often I think that people have intuitive pre-theoretic views about these questions, about the nature of intrinsic value, about the nature of rationality and morality, and about the nature of self-interest and morality. But they don't necessarily have a language for articulating these or know how to express them. And they will just dismiss views which are different to theirs, or they can't fit into that framework, but not have a very good language for explaining why those views are wrong or why their view should be favored. It's fine to have different views and to defend those, right? But I think that we should do so in a way that is informed by the relevant questions and cognizant of differing viewpoints. And that's what I try to do. So arriving at home now, let me try to wrap that up. I think that the way we do meta-ethics discussions, particularly like in apologetics or counter-apologetic space, is just bad, because we don't, I think we try to have the discussion at the level of like, do moral values exist or are they objective? And I just don't think you can get very far by trying to discuss it at that level. I think we need to try to assess some of the questions that I raised about like the status of intrinsic value, about how to understand that. There's the meta-ethics of that. The metaphysics of that is what I meant to say, but the meta-ethics as well. We need to talk about rationality and reasons. We also need to talk about self-interest and how it relates to morality. We need to have serious discussions about these, because rejecting objective morality, let me rephrase that. Many people who reject objective morality, I believe, do so for reasons which would commit them to rejecting other things as well that they also accept. Now, that's not so. It's not necessarily an issue about morality. It's maybe an issue about broader issues of rationality or epistemic reasons, or about some more general metaphysics points. Don't you hate when you get your meta ethics and your metaphysics confused? Anyway, so I think I made my point there. I'd like to have better discussions about that, but I think we're kind of crap at doing it because most people, like, they're just not really informed about this stuff, and they think that they have very well thought out views because they have a particular way of thinking about some things, but haven't really gotten the language to conceptualize that in the particular space of what does that mean for talking about morality specifically. Anyway, so there's some thoughts on morality and design. Hopefully those are of interest. I'm just going to have a quick look at chat before we, oh yes, looks like someone's been doing some moderating for me. Thanks for that. Appreciated. I just report them all, makes them go away. Cheers, I appreciate that. Thanks, Dominic, for the kind words about my podcast. Yeah, so I do have some mods. It's just that none of them are on at the moment. So someone asked a question. Can you give us some advice for a maths degree? Any hot tips? Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually did I'm just trying to think what it's called. A diploma of mathematical sciences. So it's equivalent to a maths major, but technically it was separate. But anyways, yeah, so my advice for that would be, first of all, do first year maths before committing to a major. You should be able to do that in pretty much any any college really that I know of. First year maths would be calculus and linear algebra. And if you can, probability and statistics as well. But I would say, I mean, if you're thinking of doing probability and stats, do probability and stats. But if you're thinking pure or applied, calculus and linear algebra would be the two. I mean, they'll probably be the first level courses at pretty much everywhere. But what I would say is absolutely do those first before committing to anything, because that will allow you to know, is this for me or not, essentially. If you don't really want to do a lot more maths, calculus, linear algebra, and basic probability and stats, those three will be enough for most purposes. You know, not if you want to do higher level physics or more maths research or anything like that. But as a consumer of maths, you can get a very long way by just having those. So if you just want to be more maths literate, do undergraduate uni level calculus. Generally, that will be 2 semesters worth, and 1 course of linear algebra, and then do an intro course of probability, stats and probability. So that's sort of 4 semester level subjects, assuming you have semesters. I know some unis are different. But if that's your interest, I would do those 4 and then reassess, decide, do I want more of this or is that enough? But in general, I think that if anyone wants to be educated in the sciences, you should do those 4 maths units, and you have the space and so forth, and you're not horrified of maths, because it's really, really useful to have those ideas down. It just for thinking about things, it's really helpful. In terms of beyond that, let's say you want to keep going beyond first year, decide on what you like. Usually there's people who like stats, there's people who like stats, there's people who like applied maths, and there's people who like pure maths. And they're sort of different. I did applied maths because I find pure maths very difficult. Some people much more prefer that. So you will often get a sense of which type of person you are. The subject that usually separates the wheat from the chaff there at my uni is called real analysis. I think it's often called that or something similar. It may be just called mathematical analysis or something. Phil student who likes logic, Phil maths. Yes. So you may be more interested in discrete mathematics and logic, which is often, at least at my uni, it was taught in the philosophy, the subject there where you learn about proof techniques and some set theory and things like that. That may be more interest to a person from a philosophical bent, whereas calculus probably less so. Although honestly, I think calculus is so useful for thinking about change and quantity and things that it's just handy to have. But anyway, thanks everyone for dealing with the bots. I appreciate that. So what was I saying about maths? Yeah. So, but honestly, if you're more interested in mathematical logic and things like that, you might find your philosophy department or your computer science department offer subjects that are better suited to that. So computer science will teach courses in theory of computation or something similar. They may be of more interest philosophically. So you'll probably learn in those about Gödel's incompleteness theorem and Kataki's indefinability theorem and just basic propositional and predicate logic and stuff like that. at least at my uni, maths didn't actually teach that very much. That may differ at your university, of course. But anyway, so yeah, if that's the kind of maths you're interested in, it may be better to do that through computer science or philosophy. But in terms of maths specifically, yeah, real analysis or mathematical analysis or whatever it's called will be probably the subject that will allow you to tell whether you like pure maths or applied maths. Pure maths is basically about defining more and more abstract mathematical constructs and then proving lots of stuff about them. Applied maths is, to put it very crudely, solving differential equations. Obviously, there's more to it than that, but honestly, that's a huge part of applied maths, is solving increasingly difficult differential equations. So if that's kind of your thing, then that's what applied maths is. Pure maths, if you like proving things and if you like abstract algebra, geometry and kind of things, then that's what you'll get there. And probability statistics, well, it's kind of proving stuff about probabilistic models and then trying to apply them in more and more complicated cases. So that's probably the more useful for employment purposes, honestly, unless you're specifically wanting to go into maths research or certain very specific fields. Lots of fields require these days, or maybe requires to be strong, but in a lot of fields, you'll benefit from more advanced statistics training in a lot of fields. If you even have fairly basic knowledge from what I've talked to people about, even like if you've thoroughly mastered the material of a first-year introductory probability and statistics class, like if you know that really well, like if you really understand the central limit theorem, that's a good example. If you really understand how a confidence interval is constructed, even fairly basic things like that, you will be at a very good footing in a lot of employment, like private industry, private business context, because data analysis is pretty much everywhere, but most people don't know how to do it. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was saying that his managers want him to report, what was it again? I think they wanted him to report the mean and like the 85th percentile or something like that. And I was like, why would they want you to report the 85th percentile? Like, is there some particular reason? No, there's no particular reason. Like, they've just picked that number, as far as I could tell, as far as he told me. Like, and I said, look, if I could only have two numbers from a distribution, I would choose the mean and the standard deviation. Because if it's normally distributed, which a lot of data is, that's often sufficient. Maybe I choose the median and the standard deviation, depending on how skewed it was, right? But the point is, you only need to know basic statistics to make some sort of statement about, well, like what statistics will be useful to know. But the thing is, a lot of people, standard deviation is too much. They don't understand what a standard deviation is. If you understand what a standard deviation is, that puts you like at least two standard deviations above the mean about that. Anyway, I got on off of statistics, right? The point is, basic maths and stats, basic probability and stats, very useful. So if you could only do one maths course at college, I would make it an introductory mathematics and probability and statistics course. If you could do 4, it would be 2 calculus units, linear algebra, and intro probability and stats. If you're interested in the more philosophical applications, consider an introduction to proof course, so like real analysis. That may require prerequisites to do that because often they're more advanced units. But also consider looking at philosophical logic, looking into discrete logic or discrete structures or theory of computation type courses, which may be offered through computer science. That may be of more interest for the like philosophical side of things. Anyway, I hope that some of that was of interest to people. Yeah, set theory and graph theory can also be of interest to people who are interested in that side of things. Cool. I'm just seeing if there's any last questions here. The bots are absolutely insane today. Usually they're not this bad. Usually I can get through like a stream and they're not overwhelming. Anyway, I'll leave it there for today. Thanks everyone. Hopefully you found this stream interesting. Please leave a like and a comment. That helps with the algorithm and all that. I may do another stream this weekend, actually, as I said, that there's more stuff that I want to cover. We'll see how we go. Take care. Talk to you next time.